There's nothing that cuts deeper than watching someone you love get hurt and knowing nobody will stand up for them. That's exactly what happened to Clara Mayfield when her grandmother was struck down in the street by a ranch hand, and the whole town turned away. In Red Bluff, the Dawson Brothers own everything, the land, the water, the law, and nobody dares cross them. Clara, a young schoolteacher with nowhere else to turn, sends a desperate letter up the mountain to Jonas Burke, a trapper who once visited her classroom. Days later, Jonas rides into town. He's a big man with a thick beard, wearing old buckskin, and his eyes are burning. He kneels beside the grandmother, then stands to face the Dawson men. What happens next involves no guns, no violence, just words and courage that shake the town to its core. How does one man restore justice when everyone else is too afraid to try? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Red Bluff sat in a valley where the summer heat pressed down like a heavy hand and the dust never quite settled. It was the kind of town that had been born with promise back in the 60s, when gold fever and cattle dreams brought men west with hope in their eyes and determination in their hearts. But those days had faded, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Now, in 1885, Red Bluff was a town that had learned to keep its head down and its mouth shut. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot from the church on the north end to the saloon on the south, with everything a frontier town needed pressed in between. The general store, with its creaking floorboards and smell of coffee and leather. The blacksmith's forge, where Tom Garrett worked metal into shoes and tools, his hammer ringing out a steady rhythm that marked the passing hours. The boarding house run by Mrs. Chen, a widow who'd come from San Francisco and stayed because she had nowhere else to go. And at the edge of town, painted white and proud despite the dust, stood the schoolhouse. Clara Mayfield had been teaching in that schoolhouse for 3 years now. She was 26. Slender and straight-backed, with dark hair she kept pinned up and brown eyes that still held a spark of idealism, despite everything she'd seen. She'd come to Red Bluff from Denver with notions about bringing education and enlightenment to the frontier. Her grandmother, Miss Hattie, had come with her, both to help and to find a quieter place to spend her remaining years. Miss Hattie Mayfield was 72 years old and had been a schoolteacher herself for 40 of those years. She taught in Boston, in St. Louis, and finally in Denver, where she'd raised Clara after Clara's parents died of fever. Hattie was small and round, with white hair and spectacles that sat low on her nose. She moved slowly now, leaning on a cane of polished oak, but her mind was sharp as ever, and her sense of right and wrong was absolute. The two women lived in a small house behind the schoolhouse, a tidy place with lace curtains and a garden that Hattie tended with stubborn determination, despite the harsh soil. They took their meals together, read to each other in the evenings, and shared a bond that went deeper than blood. They were each other's whole family, and in a town like Red Bluff, family was everything. But Red Bluff wasn't the town Clara had hoped to find. It was a town in chains, though most folks had stopped noticing the weight. The Dawson brothers owned the largest ranch in the territory, 20,000 acres of grazing land that sprawled across the valley and up into the foothills. Wade Dawson was the elder, a broad-shouldered man of 40 with a thick mustache and eyes that never quite smiled, even when his mouth did. His brother Cole was younger by 5 years, quieter, more thoughtful, but just as tied to the family business. Together they ran an empire built on cattle, but their real power came from something more essential than beef. They controlled the water. The creek that fed Red Bluff flowed down from the mountains and through Dawson land before it reached the town. Somewhere back in the early days, the Dawsons had claimed ownership of the water rights, and every ranch, every farm, every business in Red Bluff paid them for access. It wasn't much at first, just a few dollars a month, but over the years the fees had grown. The Dawsons raised them whenever they pleased, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Object and your water got shut off. Complain, and you might find your barn had caught fire in the night, or your cattle had wandered through a broken fence onto the road. The Dawsons employed half the men in town on their ranch. They bought supplies from the general store, kept the saloon in business, and made sure everyone knew where the power lay. Sheriff Polk, a tired man in his 50s with a badge that seemed to weigh heavier each year, had long ago learned not to cross them. He kept the peace in small ways, broke up fights between drunks, and looked the other direction when it mattered. Clara had watched it happen slowly, this erosion of the town's spirit. Good people, decent people, had learned to swallow their objections and smile when they wanted to shout. She'd seen it in her classroom, too. Children came to school with lessons already learned at home about keeping quiet, about not making trouble, about accepting the way things were. It made her heart ache. 5 years ago, something different had happened. A man came down from the mountains, a trapper and wilderness guide named Jonas Burke. He'd been hired by the territorial government to survey the high country, and he'd stopped in Red Bluff to resupply. Someone at the general store mentioned the school, and Jonas had shown up one morning and asked if he could speak to the children about the wilderness, about tracking and survival and the ways of the wild. Clara, who'd been teaching for less than a year then, had been delighted. The children sat spellbound as Jonas talked about reading signs in the forest, about respecting the land, about the quiet patience it took to truly see the world around you. He was a big man, tall and broad, with a thick beard and hands scarred from a life outdoors. But his voice was gentle when he spoke to the children, and his eyes were kind. He'd stayed 3 days, coming each morning to teach, and then disappearing back to wherever he'd camped outside of town. On the last day, as he prepared to head back into the mountains, Clara had thanked him. "These children don't get to see much beyond this valley," she'd said. "You've given them a gift." Jonas had looked at her with those steady eyes, grey as winter clouds, and nodded. "You're giving them a bigger gift," he'd said. "You're teaching them to think. Don't ever stop doing that, Miss Mayfield. A town needs people who remember how to think for themselves." Then he'd tipped his hat and ridden away, and Clara hadn't seen him since, but she'd remembered him. Remembered the way he'd commanded respect without demanding it. Remembered the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. And she'd remembered his words about thinking for themselves, even as she watched the town forget how. Miss Hattie remembered him too. She'd attended all 3 of his talks, sitting in the back of the classroom with her hands folded and her eyes bright. Afterward, she'd told Clara that Jonas Burke reminded her of men from an earlier time. Men who'd built the West on principles instead of just ambition. "He's got his father in him," Hattie had said, though she wouldn't explain what she meant. Now, in the summer of 1885, Clara stood at the window of the schoolhouse and watched the town go about its business. It was late afternoon, and the children had gone home. The heat still pressed down, making the air shimmer above the street. A wagon rolled past, the driver tipping his hat to her. 2 women stood outside the general store, talking in low voices. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But Clara could feel the tension underneath, the way you could feel a storm coming before the first clouds appeared. Red Bluff was a town waiting for something, though nobody could say what. Miss Hattie came up beside her, moving carefully with her cane. "You're brooding again," Hattie said softly. "I'm thinking," Clara replied. "Dangerous habit in a town like this." Clara smiled despite herself. "Someone taught me to think for myself." "Then that someone did you both a service and a disservice," Hattie said, but her eyes were warm. She reached out and patted Clara's hand. "Come on, let's go home and make supper. Tomorrow's another day, and those children will need you fresh." They walked together through the dusty yard, past the brass bell that hung by the door. It was the same bell that had called students to class for 30 years, first in Denver and now here. Hattie had insisted on bringing it when they moved, said it represented something permanent in a world that changed too fast. The bell was polished and cared for, its brass gleaming even in the fading light. Inside their small house, Clara lit the lamp while Hattie settled into her chair by the window. The evening routine was comforting in its familiarity. Clara pumped water from the cistern they shared with the school, heated it on the stove, and began preparing beans and cornbread. Hattie peeled potatoes with practiced efficiency. Her hands still steady despite her age. "I've been thinking about writing to Jonas Burke," Clara said suddenly. Surprising herself, Hattie looked up, her spectacles catching the lamplight. "Have you now?" "Just to see how he's doing. To tell him the school is still going. The children still remember his visit. Is that all you'd tell him?" Clara felt her cheeks warm. "What else would I say?" Hattie smiled gently. "You might tell him the truth about this town, about how it's changed, about how people have forgotten what he tried to teach those children. And what good would that do? He's up in the mountains somewhere living his life. He doesn't need to know about our troubles." "Maybe not," Hattie agreed. She went back to her potatoes, but Clara could see the wheels turning behind those bright eyes. Her grandmother had always been good at planting seeds and letting them grow. They ate their simple supper in comfortable silence. Then Clara cleared the dishes while Hattie prepared for bed. The old woman moved slowly, each step measured, and Clara watched with a mixture of love and concern. Hattie was strong, but she was also 72 years old, and the years were catching up. After Hattie had settled in, Clara sat by the lamp and tried to grade papers, but her mind kept wandering. She thought about Jonas Burke and his quiet strength. She thought about the children in her classroom and the fear she saw in their parents' eyes. She thought about the Dawson Brothers and their grip on the town, and she thought about her grandmother's words. Maybe Jonas didn't need to know about their troubles, but maybe knowing someone like him was out there, someone who hadn't forgotten what courage looked like, was enough to keep hope alive. Outside, the night settled over Red Bluff like a blanket. The saloon piano played its tinny tune. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The stars came out, brilliant and infinite, reminding Clara that the world was bigger than this valley, bigger than the fear that had taken root here. Tomorrow would be another day in Red Bluff, another day of teaching and hoping and watching good people stay silent. But tonight, for just a moment, Clara allowed herself to remember that somewhere in those mountains, there lived a man who still believed that thinking for yourself mattered. It was a small comfort, but in a town like Red Bluff, you learned to hold tight to whatever comfort you could find. Saturday morning came bright and hot, the kind of day where the sun felt like it was pressing down on your shoulders with actual weight. It was market day in Red Bluff, and by 9 o'clock, the main street was busy with wagons and people moving between the shops and stalls that had been set up along the boardwalk. Clara and Miss Hattie made their way slowly down the street, Hattie leaning on her polished oak cane and carrying a cloth shopping bag. They needed supplies for the school, paper and chalk, and a new slate to replace one that had cracked. Hattie also wanted to pick up some thread and fabric, always thinking ahead to the winter months when her hands would need projects to keep busy. The general store was crowded, so they decided to start at the dry goods shop across the street. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the shop, greeted them warmly and helped Hattie select some good cotton fabric in a cheerful blue pattern. Clara found the chalk and paper they needed, and they were just finishing their purchases when they heard raised voices outside. Through the window, Clara could see a commotion near the hitching post. Her horse was dancing sideways, spooked by something, and a man's angry voice cut through the morning air. "Watch where you're going, old woman." Clara's stomach tightened. She recognized that voice. Colt Brenner, one of the Dawson ranch hands, a man known for his quick temper and quicker fists. She moved to the window, Hattie coming up beside her. Outside, they could see what had happened. Hattie's small handcart, which they'd left by the boardwalk, had apparently rolled slightly and bumped against a horse's leg. It was nothing, really, barely a tap. But Colt Brenner was standing there with his chest puffed out and his face red, looking for a reason to be angry. "I should go out there," Clara said. "We'll both go," Hattie replied, her voice steady, but Clara could see the worry in her eyes. They paid Mrs. Patterson quickly and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The street had gone quiet in that particular way it did when trouble was brewing. People were watching but keeping their distance, the way they always did when the Dawson men were involved. Colt Brenner stood near his horse, and beside him was Wade Dawson himself, sitting astride a big sorrel gelding and looking down at the scene with an expression of casual amusement. 3 other ranch hands lounged nearby, enjoying the show. Clara and Hattie approached the cart. Hattie moved forward with as much dignity as she could muster, leaning on her cane. "I apologize if my cart startled your horse," Hattie said, her voice clear and firm. "It must have rolled." "No harm was meant," Colt Brenner spat in the dust. "No harm was meant," he mimicked in a high voice. "You hit my horse, you dried-up old crow." Clara felt anger flash through her. "That's enough. My grandmother apologized. There's no need for rudeness. Your grandmother needs to learn to control her property," Colt shot back. He took a step forward, and Clara could smell whiskey on his breath, even though it wasn't yet noon. Or maybe she's just too old and feeble to be out on the street. "I'm old enough to remember when men had manners," Hattie said quietly. "And I'm not too feeble to recognize a bully when I see one." The words hung in the air. Clara wanted to pull her grandmother back, to apologize and smooth things over, but she also felt a surge of pride. Hattie had never been one to back down from the truth, even when wisdom might suggest otherwise. Colt's face darkened. "What did you say to me?" "You heard me just fine," Hattie replied. Wade Dawson laughed from his horse. "Let it go, Colt. She's just a mouthy old schoolmarm. Not worth your time." But something had been lit in Colt Brenner, some spark of rage or shame or drunken pride. He stepped closer to Hattie, towering over her. "Maybe somebody needs to teach you some respect," he said. Clara moved between them. "Leave her alone." "We're going." She reached for Hattie's arm, ready to guide her away, to end this before it got worse. But Colt reached out and shoved Clara aside. Not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make her stumble. "I'm talking to the old woman," he snarled, and then, before Clara could even process what was happening, Colt Brenner drew back his hand and struck Miss Hattie. Across the face, with the back of his fist. The sound of it echoed down the street like a gunshot. Hattie's spectacles flew off, and her cane clattered to the boardwalk as she fell backward. Her head struck the wooden planks with a sickening thud, and she lay there, stunned and bleeding from her nose, her white hair coming loose from its pins. For a moment, everything stopped. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara screamed and dropped to her knees beside her grandmother. "Grandma! Grandma, can you hear me?" Hattie's eyes were open but unfocused. Blood ran from her nose, and a bruise was already forming on her cheek. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak moan. Clara looked up at Colt Brenner with pure fury in her eyes. "You hit her!" "You hit an old woman." Colt stepped back, seeming surprised by what he'd done, but trying to cover it with bravado. She had it coming. "Oh, the old bat!" Wade Dawson's expression hadn't changed. He sat on his horse, watching with that same amused detachment, as if this were all just entertainment. "Someone help me!" Clara cried out to the crowd that had gathered. "Someone get the doctor!" For a terrible moment, no one moved. They all just stood there, watching, frozen by fear or indifference, or the simple habit of not getting involved in Dawson business. Then Tom Garrett, the blacksmith, pushed through the crowd. He was a big man with kind eyes and soot on his apron. He knelt beside Hattie without a word and gently lifted her in his arms, as if she weighed nothing. "I'll take her to Doc Morrison's," he said quietly to Clara. Clara grabbed Hattie's cane and spectacles and followed Tom down the street, her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face. Behind them, she could hear Wade Dawson's voice, casual and unconcerned. "Come on, boys. Show's over. Let's get a drink." The sound of their laughter followed Clara all the way to the doctor's office. Doc Morrison was a thin, grey-haired man who'd been practicing medicine in Red Bluff for 20 years. He examined Hattie carefully, while Clara hovered nearby, wringing her hands and trying not to cry. "She has a concussion," Doc Morrison said finally. "The blow to her face broke the skin, and her nose is bruised but not broken. The fall gave her a nasty knock to the back of the head. She needs rest and quiet. No excitement for at least a week, maybe more. Will she be all right?" Clara asked, her voice small. "In time, yes. But Clara, she's 72 years old. A blow like this, a fall like that, it takes a toll. She's going to be sore and confused for a few days. You'll need to watch her closely." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "Can I take her home?" Let her rest here for an hour. Make sure she's steady on her feet. Then yes, you can take her home, but someone should stay with her tonight. Wake her every few hours to make sure she's coherent. I'll stay with her, Clara said. I won't leave her side. Tom Garrett, who'd waited quietly in the corner, stepped forward. I'll help you get her home when she's ready. And Clara, I saw what happened. That was wrong, what Colt did. Dead wrong. Will you tell the sheriff? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Tom looked away. I'll tell him, but you know how it is. Yes, Clara knew how it was. She knew exactly how it was. An hour later, with Hattie conscious but weak, they made their way slowly home. Tom carried Hattie again, and Clara walked beside them, holding her grandmother's hand. The main street was back to normal, people going about their business as if nothing had happened. The market stalls were doing brisk trade. Children ran and played. Life went on. But something had broken inside Clara, some last fragile hope that Red Bluff was still a place where justice mattered, where right and wrong meant something. She settled Hattie into bed and sat beside her, holding her hand and watching her breathe. Her grandmother's face was swollen and discolored, her eyes closed. She looked so small, so frail, so vulnerable. Clara thought about Jonas Burke and his words about thinking for yourself. She thought about courage and silence and the price of both, and she made a decision. That evening, after making sure Hattie was resting comfortably, Clara sat at the small writing desk in the corner of their house. She lit the lamp, took out a sheet of paper and began to write. Her hand trembled as she formed the words, and tears blurred her vision, but she kept writing. She wrote about what had happened in the street. She wrote about Colt Brenner and Wade Dawson, and the way the whole town had watched and done nothing. She wrote about her grandmother lying in bed, hurt and humiliated, and about how the sheriff would do nothing because the Dawsons owned this town. She wrote about fear and silence, and what happens when good people stop standing up for what's right, and she wrote one final line. The hardest words she'd ever put to paper. Please, Mr. Burke, if you remember us, if you remember what you said about thinking for ourselves and standing for something, please come. We need help. I need help. My grandmother needs someone who isn't afraid. Please. She signed it simply, Clara Mayfield, Red Bluff, and folded it carefully. The next morning, before school, she rode out to the way station where the postal rider stopped on his route into the mountains. She paid him extra to make sure the letter got delivered, gave him detailed directions to Jonas Burke's usual territory. I don't know if I'll find him, the rider said, pocketing the coins. That's a lot of country up there. Please try, Clara said. It's important. The rider nodded and tucked the letter into his saddlebag. Clara watched him ride away, heading north toward the mountains, carrying her desperate hope with him. Then she went back to her grandmother's bedside and waited. Jonas spent the next 3 days in the church basement, working through boxes of old records by lamplight. Reverend Matthews brought him meals and coffee and sometimes sat with him, offering context about names and dates from Red Bluff's history. The work was tedious, but Jonas was patient. He'd learned patience in the mountains, where rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes could cost your life. He read through birth certificates and marriage licenses, property transfers and business agreements. Most of it was routine, the ordinary paperwork of a frontier town, growing slowly over the years. But on the afternoon of the third day, he found something. It was in a box marked Town Founding Documents, 1867, that had been pushed to the back of the highest shelf, covered in dust. Inside were yellowed papers, some barely legible, others preserved better by luck than design. And near the bottom of the box, Jonas found a leather folder tied with a ribbon that had rotted nearly through. Inside the folder was the original Red Bluff Town Charter. Jonas read it carefully, his finger tracing the elaborate handwriting. The document established Red Bluff as an incorporated town, with specific provisions for governance and resource management. And there, in clear language that left no room for interpretation, was a section titled Community Water Trust. The creek and its tributaries were designated as common property, held in trust for all residents. No individual could claim ownership. A board of 5 citizens would manage distribution and maintenance. Every household had equal rights, regardless of property or wealth. It was signed by 12 founding members of the town, witnessed by a territorial judge, and stamped with an official seal. Jonas carefully copied the relevant passages into his notebook, making sure to get every word exactly right. Then he looked at the signatures at the bottom of the document. One name stood out, Thomas Burke. Jonas stared at the signature. His father's name. His father had been one of the founders of Red Bluff. He felt something shift inside him, a connection to this place he hadn't expected. His father had helped build this town, had signed his name to a document establishing justice and equality in the allocation of their most precious resource. And the Dawsons had stolen it. There was another name next to his father's, Samuel Dawson. The two signatures were side by side, as if they'd stood together when the document was signed. Partners then. Friends maybe, building something together. What had happened to turn partnership into theft? Jonas carefully returned the charter to its folder and brought it upstairs. Reverend Matthews looked up from his desk when Jonas emerged from the basement, blinking in the brighter light. "Did you find something?" Matthews asked. Jonas set the folder on the desk. "The original town charter. It establishes a community water trust. The Dawsons' ownership claim is illegal. It always has been." Matthews opened the folder with trembling hands and read through the document. His eyes widened behind his spectacles. "This is it," he whispered. "This is proof." "Yes," Jonas said. "But proof alone won't change anything. People need to believe they can stand up. They need to believe the law matters more than power. What will you do?" Jonas thought about it. He could go to Sheriff Polk with the charter, demand action. But Polk had already shown himself unwilling to confront the Dawsons. He could try to find a judge, but Wade Dawson probably had judges in his pocket too. No, this needed a different approach. A public approach. "I'm going to show this to the people," Jonas said. "All of them. And I'm going to give them a choice about what kind of town they want to live in." Over the next few days, Jonas moved through Red Bluff like a quiet storm. He visited homes in the evening after the workday was done. He sat at kitchen tables and spoke in calm, measured tones about the charter and what it meant. He started with the people who'd shown some spark of resistance. Tom Garrett, the blacksmith, who'd helped carry Miss Hattie to the doctor. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house, who'd brought soup. A young rancher named Daniel Webb, who'd been squeezed by rising water fees and Dawson pressure to sell his land. To each of them, Jonas showed a copy of the relevant sections of the charter. He explained the law clearly and simply. The water belonged to everyone. The Dawsons had been collecting fees illegally for 15 years. Every dollar paid was theft, but what can we do? Tom Garrett asked, sitting in his small house behind the forge. His wife and children had gone to bed, and he spoke in a low voice. "Even if we have the law on our side, the Dawsons have guns and money, and men willing to use both. They have those things because you've let them have power," Jonas said. "Power isn't taken, Tom. It's given. And it can be taken back. Easy for you to say. You don't have a family depending on you. I have 3 children. If I cross the Dawsons and lose my business, what happens to them?" Jonas understood the fear. It was real and legitimate. But it was also a cage. What happens to your children if they grow up in a town where might makes right? Jonas asked. What lessons are they learning when they see their father bow his head to men who steal and assault and face no consequences? Tom looked down at his calloused hands. "That's not fair." "No," Jonas agreed. "None of this is fair. But that's exactly why it has to change." The conversation with Mrs. Chen was different. She was a widow who'd lost her husband to a mining accident years ago. She'd built her boarding house with her own hands and run it with quiet efficiency. She had no illusions about the Dawsons. "I've seen what they do to people who resist," she said, pouring tea in her small kitchen. "They don't just ruin you financially. They destroy you completely. That's what bullies do," Jonas said. "They make the cost of resistance seem higher than the cost of submission. But Mrs. Chen, you've survived worse than the Dawsons. You lost your husband, and you didn't give up. You built something from nothing. You're stronger than you think," she smiled sadly. Strength and wisdom are different things, Mr. Burke. Wisdom tells me to keep my head down. And what does your heart tell you? She was quiet for a long moment. My heart tells me I'm tired of being afraid. Daniel Webb was the easiest to convince because he'd already reached his breaking point. He was 28, running a small ranch that his father had left him. The Dawsons wanted his land because it bordered their property and had good water access. They'd been pressuring him to sell, raising his water fees, making it harder to operate profitably. "I'm going to lose the ranch anyway," Daniel said bitterly. "Another year of their fees and I'll be broke. Might as well go down fighting." "This isn't about going down," Jonas said. "It's about standing up. There's a difference." Jonas showed him the charter, explained the legal foundation. Daniel's eyes lit up with something Jonas recognized, hope mixed with anger. A dangerous combination, but one that could be channeled into action. "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked. "Courage," Jonas said. "When the time comes, I need you to stand with me in public. To show other people it's possible. When will that be?" "Soon. I'm gathering people one at a time. When we have enough, we'll make our move." But Jonas knew time was running short. Word of his activities was spreading. People talked, and in a small town, secrets were hard to keep. On the 5th evening since finding the charter, Jonas was walking back to the Mayfield house when 2 men stepped out of the alley ahead of him. He recognized them as Dawson ranch hands, though he didn't know their names. "You're Jonas Burke," one of them said. "Not a question. I am. Mr. Dawson wants you to know you're not welcome in Red Bluff. He suggests you pack up and head back to wherever you came from." Jonas stood still, his hands relaxed at his sides. "That's interesting advice. Please thank Mr. Dawson for his concern, but I'll be staying a while longer." The second man stepped closer. He was bigger than his companion, with scarred knuckles and mean eyes. "Maybe you didn't hear right. That wasn't a suggestion." "I heard fine," Jonas said calmly. "What I'm telling you is that I don't take orders from Wade Dawson." The big man's hand moved toward his gun, but Jonas had already assessed the situation. 2 armed men in a darkening alley looking to intimidate or worse. He'd been in situations like this before. "Think carefully," Jonas said, his voice dropping to something cold and flat. "You draw that weapon, you'd better be prepared to use it. And if you use it, you'd better not miss." "Because I won't," the man hesitated. Something in Jonas's eyes, in his absolute stillness, made him reconsider. This wasn't a scared shopkeeper or a desperate farmer. This was something else entirely. The first man put a hand on his companion's arm. "Come on." "We delivered the message." They backed away, keeping their eyes on Jonas until they reached the corner and disappeared. Jonas continued walking, but his mind was working. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it confirmed what he'd suspected. The Dawsons knew what he was doing, and they were getting nervous. Good. Nervous men made mistakes. When he reached the Mayfield house, Clara was waiting on the porch. She'd seen him coming down the street, and the worry on her face told him she'd witnessed at least part of the encounter. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine. Just a friendly warning from our local landlords. Jonas, maybe you should—" "I'm not leaving," he said firmly but gently. "Not until this is finished." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come inside. There's stew, and you need to eat." Inside, Miss Hattie was sitting up in a chair for the first time in days. Her bruises had faded to yellow-green, and her eyes had regained some of their old spark. When Jonas entered, she smiled. "You look like a man who's been working hard," she said. "I found something," Jonas told them both. He pulled out his notebook and showed them his copies of the charter. He explained everything: the water trust, his father's signature, the illegal nature of the Dawsons' control. As he talked, he watched Clara's face transform from worry to wonder to something that looked like fierce determination. "Your father founded this town?" she asked. "He was one of the founders, yes. I never knew. My mother left when I was very young and she never spoke of it." "Then this is personal for you too," Miss Hattie said quietly. "It's personal for everyone in this town," Jonas replied. "They just don't know it yet." The next morning, Miss Hattie surprised them both by announcing she wanted to help. "You've been sitting at my bedside for over a week," she said to Clara. And you, Mr. Burke, have been fighting my battle. I may be old and bruised, but I'm not useless, Jonas smiled. I never thought you were, Miss Hattie. What did you have in mind? I've kept journals, she said. For 30 years I've been writing down what I observe. The people, the events, the way things change over time. I have journals from Denver and I have journals from here. 3 years' worth of observations about Red Bluff? Clara looked surprised. I never knew you kept journals. You never asked, Hattie said with a gentle smile. They're in the trunk in my room. Bring them out, dear. Clara retrieved a leather trunk from Hattie's bedroom and opened it to reveal a stack of cloth-bound journals, each one labeled with dates. Hattie selected 3 and opened the first one. I started keeping detailed notes about the Dawsons shortly after we arrived, she explained. Something about them troubled me from the start. The way people flinched when their name was mentioned. The fear in the air. So I watched and I wrote. Jonas leaned forward as Hattie began reading entries aloud. They painted a disturbing picture of the Dawsons' rise to absolute control. There was an entry from 2 years ago about a rancher named Peterson who'd complained publicly about water fees. A week later, his barn burned down. No investigation, no arrests. Another entry from 18 months ago described a merchant who'd tried to organize a petition for fair water rates. His store was vandalized 3 times in 2 weeks. He sold out and left town. A more recent entry detailed how Daniel Webb's father had died under mysterious circumstances just before Daniel inherited the ranch. The official story was a riding accident, but witnesses had mentioned seeing Dawson men in the area that day. You've documented everything, Jonas said, with something like awe in his voice. A teacher learns to pay attention, Hattie replied, and to write things down before they're forgotten or rewritten. Jonas spent the afternoon reading through all 3 journals, making notes of the most damning entries. Combined with the town charter, this was powerful evidence, not just of illegal water control, but of a pattern of intimidation, violence, and possibly even murder. The question was how to use it. That evening, Jonas met with his small group of allies. They gathered in Tom Garrett's house after dark, 7 people in total. Tom and his wife Sarah, Mrs. Chen, Daniel Webb, a farmer named Henry Walsh, who'd lost land to the Dawsons 5 years ago, and Eleanor Price, an elderly woman who'd known Samuel Dawson and had never trusted his son. Jonas laid out everything he'd found. The charter, the journals, the documented pattern of abuse. He watched their faces as understanding dawned, followed by anger, then fear, then something else. A kind of awakening. What you're showing us, Tom said slowly, is that the Dawsons have been breaking the law for 15 years. That's right, and that we've been paying them for the privilege of being stolen from. Yes. Tom's face darkened. I've paid them over $300 in the last 5 years alone. Money I could barely afford. Money that should have gone to my family. I've paid more than that, Daniel said bitterly. We all have, Mrs. Chen added. And what do we have to show for it? A town that's afraid of its own shadow. Jonas let them talk, let the anger build. Anger was useful if it could be directed properly. Here's what I propose, he said when they'd settled down. We call a town meeting. We present the evidence publicly. We show everyone what the charter says and what the journals document. We give people a choice. The Dawsons won't allow it, Henry Walsh said. He was a big man with weathered skin and nervous eyes. They'll shut it down or worse. They can't shut down a meeting in a church, Jonas said. And they won't risk violence in front of the whole town. Their power depends on people believing they're legitimate. If we expose them publicly, that legitimacy crumbles. What if people are too afraid to act even after they know the truth? Sarah Garrett asked. It was a good question. The one Jonas had been wrestling with himself. Then we'll know this town isn't ready to save itself, he said honestly. But I don't think that's what will happen. Fear grows in darkness and silence. Bring it into the light and it loses its power. Eleanor Price, who'd been quiet throughout, finally spoke. I knew your father, Jonas. Everyone turned to look at her. Thomas Burke was a good man, Eleanor continued. He and Samuel Dawson were like brothers when they founded this town. They had a vision of something fair and decent. When Thomas went off to fight in the war, Samuel promised to hold his share in trust. But Thomas never came back, and Samuel told everyone that Thomas had abandoned his claim. "He took everything. Did you know Thomas had a son?" Jonas asked. No, Samuel said Thomas had no family. That's why he felt justified in claiming it all. Jonas felt a cold anger settle in his chest. His father had been betrayed by his best friend, his legacy stolen, his son left with nothing, not even the knowledge of what had been taken. "Then this is about more than water rights," Jonas said quietly. "It's about honoring the memory of the men who built this town on principles that still matter." The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history settling on them. "When do we call this meeting?" Tom finally asked. "Soon," Jonas said. "I need a few more days to prepare, to make sure we have everything documented and organized, and to give people time to think about what side they want to be on when the moment comes." "The Dawsons will hear about it," Daniel warned. "I'm counting on it," Jonas said. "I want them there. I want them to see what happens when people stop being afraid." After the meeting broke up, Jonas walked back through the dark streets alone. He could feel the town holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The tension had been building for years, maybe decades. He was just the spark that would light the fuse. The question was whether the explosion would destroy the town or free it. When he reached the Mayfield house, Clara was waiting on the porch again. She seemed to make a habit of it, watching for him to return safely. "How did it go?" she asked. "We're going to call a town meeting, present everything publicly." "When?" 4 days from now. Sunday after church service. Maximum attendance." Clara nodded slowly. "The Dawsons won't take this lying down." "No," Jonas agreed. "They won't, which is why I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Keep your grandmother safe. If things get dangerous, I want you both away from the center of it." "This is our fight too," Clara protested. "I know, but Miss Hattie has already been hurt once. I won't let it happen again." Clara looked at him for a long moment, and Jonas saw something in her eyes he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or something more complicated. "You're a good man, Jonas Burke," she said softly. "I'm just a man who's tired of watching bullies win," he replied. Inside, they found Miss Hattie still awake, sitting by the lamp with one of her journals open. "I remembered something else," she said when they entered. "There's a man who might help us, Matthew Harrison. He's a territorial judge who rides circuit through these parts. He's due in Red Bluff next week. If we can get him to see the evidence before the Dawsons get to him, we might have official support." Jonas sat down across from her. "Would he listen? He's known for being honest." "That's rare in these parts. If we can show him the charter and the journals, he might issue an injunction against the Dawsons." It was a good thought. Having legal authority on their side would make everything easier. "Do you know when he's due to arrive?" Jonas asked. "Tuesday, typically. He stays at the boarding house." Jonas looked at Mrs. Chen, who nodded. "I can make sure he gets the information as soon as he arrives." Plans were forming, pieces falling into place. Jonas could feel momentum building, like water behind a dam, waiting to break through. 4 more days until the town meeting. 4 days to prepare, to gather support, to make sure everything was ready. 4 days until Red Bluff would have to choose what kind of town it wanted to be. 2 nights before the scheduled town meeting, Jonas sat with Clara and Miss Hattie, organizing the evidence they would present. The town charter was carefully preserved in a protective folder. Miss Hattie's journals were marked with ribbon at the most important entries. Jonas had prepared a clear, simple explanation of the legal situation that anyone could understand. They were reviewing everything one more time when Miss Hattie suddenly stood up and moved to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. "There's something else," she said. "Something I should have shown you days ago, but I wasn't sure it mattered." She opened the cabinet and withdrew a wooden box, old and worn smooth by time. She set it on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were various small items, a cameo brooch, some old coins, a few letters tied with string. And beneath those, a photograph. Hattie lifted it out with trembling fingers and handed it to Jonas. The photograph was faded, the kind taken in the early days when sitting for a portrait was a formal affair. It showed two young men, both in their 20s, standing side by side with their arms around each other's shoulders. They were smiling, relaxed, clearly good friends. Jonas stared at the image. One of the men looked remarkably like himself. Same broad shoulders, same strong features, same steady eyes. He knew without being told that this was his father. The other man was leaner, with sharp features and an intelligent gaze. Written on the back in careful script were the words, Jonas Burke and Samuel Dawson, Red Bluff, 1858. Jonas felt his heart begin to pound. My father and Samuel Dawson were friends. More than friends, Hattie said quietly. Partners. They founded Red Bluff together. Clara leaned over to look at the photograph. But how did you get this? Your father gave it to me, Hattie said, looking at Jonas. Before he went off to war, he and Samuel had staked their claims together, built the first structures, established the water trust. They were like brothers. Thomas asked me to hold on to a few of his possessions, said he'd collect them when he came back. But he never came back, Jonas said, his voice hollow. No. He died at Shiloh in 1862. I kept his things, hoping someday to find his family. But Samuel told everyone Thomas had no wife, no children. He said Thomas's share of everything should revert to him as the surviving partner. Jonas looked up sharply. But that was a lie. My mother was alive. I was alive. Yes, Hattie confirmed. Which means Samuel Dawson didn't just take control of the water rights. He stole your father's entire stake in Red Bluff. The land, the water, the businesses they'd started together. All of it should have gone to Thomas's heirs. To you. The room fell silent. Jonas stood and walked to the window, his mind reeling. He'd come to Red Bluff to help two women who'd been wronged. He'd discovered illegal water control and a town living in fear. But now he learned that he was the rightful heir to half of what the Dawsons claimed as theirs. This wasn't just about justice for the town anymore. It was personal in a way he hadn't anticipated. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? He asked, still looking out the window. I wasn't certain at first that you were Thomas's son, Hattie said. The name was the same, but Burke isn't uncommon. Then when you arrived and I saw you, I knew. You looked just like him. But I wasn't sure if it mattered to your purpose here. It matters, Jonas said quietly. It changes everything. Does it? Clara asked. I mean, does it change what needs to happen? The Dawsons still control the water illegally. The town is still being oppressed. Your personal claim doesn't alter those facts. Jonas turned to face them. No, but it gives me legal standing to challenge the Dawsons directly. It means I'm not just an outsider making trouble. I'm a rightful heir, reclaiming what was stolen from my family. He sat back down at the table and looked at the photograph again, really studying his father's face. Jonas Burke looked happy in the image, young and full of hope, with his arm around his best friend. He had no idea that friend would betray him, steal from his son, build an empire on lies. There's more, Hattie said. She reached into the box and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. This is the original partnership agreement between Thomas and Samuel. It clearly states that if either partner dies, his share goes to his heirs, not to the surviving partner. Jonas unfolded the document carefully. It was exactly as Hattie described, signed by both men and witnessed by a notary. Legal and binding. This means Wade Dawson has been operating on false premises his entire life, Jonas said. Everything his father told him about how they acquired the land was a lie. Or Wade knows the truth and has been perpetuating his father's fraud, Clara suggested. Jonas considered this. Either way, it doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that we now have proof not only that the water trust is legitimate, but that the Dawson claim to ownership has no legal foundation whatsoever. He stood and paced the room, thinking through the implications. This changed his strategy. He could present this evidence at the town meeting, reveal himself as Jonas Burke's son, and reclaim his inheritance. It would be dramatic and effective, but something made him hesitate. What's wrong? Clara asked, watching his face. "I'm thinking about what this will look like," Jonas said. "If I present this as a personal claim, people might see it as just a property dispute between me and the Dawsons. Two men fighting over land and money. It loses the moral clarity." "But it's your right," Hattie said. "Your father's legacy." "I know, but the water rights issue is bigger than my personal claim. It affects everyone in town. If I make this about my inheritance, it might distract from the larger injustice." Clara stood and came to stand beside him. "You could do both. Present the town charter and the water trust first. Show everyone that the Dawsons have been stealing from the community. Then, when that's established, reveal your connection." Jonas looked at her. "Why would that order matter?" "Because it shows your priorities," she said. "You came here to help us, not to reclaim an inheritance you didn't even know existed. If people see that you put the community's needs ahead of your personal claim, they'll trust you more. They'll see you're not just another landowner fighting over property. It was wise counsel." Jonas nodded slowly. "There's something else to consider," Hattie added. "Cole Dawson, Wade's younger brother. What about him? He's different from Wade, quieter, more thoughtful. And I've seen him in church, actually listening to the sermons about justice and mercy. I wonder if he knows about his father's betrayal of Thomas. You think he might be an ally?" Jonas asked skeptically. "I think he might be troubled by what his family has done, even if he doesn't know the full extent. If you could talk to him privately, show him this evidence, you might find an unexpected supporter." Jonas thought about this. Dividing the Dawson brothers would be strategically valuable. But it was also risky. If Cole warned Wade about what was coming, they'd lose the element of surprise. "I'll think about it," Jonas said. They spent another hour organizing their presentation for the town meeting. Jonas practiced explaining the charter and the trust in simple terms. Clara helped refine his language, making it clearer and more accessible. Hattie added emotional weight, reminding them to frame everything in terms of family and community, not just law and property. Finally, as the night grew late, Clara asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "What will you do if you win? If the town reclaims the water rights, and your claim to your father's estate is recognized, will you stay in Red Bluff?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment. He'd asked himself the same question, and still wasn't sure of the answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My life is in the mountains. I'm not a town person. I don't know how to live surrounded by people, following rules and schedules." "Your father managed," Hattie said gently. "He was a mountain man too before he settled here. And look what happened to him. He left for war and never came back. His best friend stole everything. His son grew up never knowing he had a legacy here." "That wasn't his fault," Clara said. "That was Samuel Dawson's betrayal and war. Neither of those things were Thomas's choice." "No," Jonas agreed. "But they're a reminder that building something permanent in this world is risky. The mountains don't betray you. They're honest, hard but honest. So are people," Clara said, "when they're allowed to be." Jonas looked at her, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes. She believed in Red Bluff, believed it could be saved. "Maybe she was right. Let's get through the town meeting first," he said. "Then we'll worry about what comes after." But as he lay on his bedroll on the porch that night, Jonas couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. His father and Samuel Dawson, arms around each other, smiling at the camera, full of dreams for the town they were building together. His father had believed in partnership, in community, in trusting people, and it had cost him everything. Jonas had spent his adult life trusting only himself, living alone, depending on no one. It had kept him safe, but it had also kept him isolated. Now he was being asked to trust again. To trust that the people of Red Bluff would find their courage. To trust that justice could prevail over power. To trust that his father's dream wasn't completely lost. It was a lot to ask of a man who'd learned the hard way that trust was dangerous. But as he looked up at the stars, the same stars his father must have looked at when he first came to this valley, Jonas felt something shift inside him. A sense of purpose that went beyond just helping Clara and Miss Hattie. Maybe he was here to finish what his father started. To see the vision through, even if it had taken 40 years and a betrayal to bring him to it. Maybe some legacies were worth the risk of trust after all. The morning of the town meeting dawned clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that made the mountains stand out sharp against the blue sky. Jonas woke before sunrise, as he always did, and sat on the porch, watching the town come to life. Today, everything would change, one way or another. He'd spent the previous day making final preparations. The documents were organized and protected. His presentation was practiced. The small group of allies knew their roles. Reverend Matthews had agreed to moderate the meeting and lend it the authority of the church, but Jonas had also spent time preparing something more personal. In the wooden box that Hattie had shown him, there was one more item he'd discovered, his father's pocket watch. It was silver, tarnished with age, and when Jonas opened it, he found an inscription inside the cover. Time reveals all truth. TB 1860. His father had carried this watch, had checked it countless times, had trusted that eventually truth would prevail. Jonas slipped it into his vest pocket now, feeling its weight against his chest. Clara emerged from the house as the sun was breaking over the eastern ridge. "You're up early," she said, bringing him coffee. "Couldn't sleep much. Nervous?" Jonas considered the question. Not nervous exactly, but aware that today matters, that what happens in that church will shape this town's future, and yours, Clara added quietly. He looked at her, this young woman who'd had the courage to call for help when everyone else was too afraid. "And mine," he agreed. Inside, Miss Hattie was already dressed and sitting at the breakfast table. Her bruises had faded to barely visible marks, but Jonas knew the deeper wounds would take longer to heal. She looked determined, though, her back straight and her eyes clear. "I'm coming to the meeting," she announced, before anyone could suggest otherwise. "Grandma, are you sure?" Clara asked. "It might be difficult seeing Colt Brenner again. All the more reason I should be there," Hattie said firmly. "I won't hide from what happened, and people need to see that I'm still standing." Jonas nodded with respect. "You're right. Your presence will matter." They ate a simple breakfast, though none of them had much appetite. The waiting was harder than the doing would be. At 9 o'clock, Tom Garrett arrived with his wagon to help transport Miss Hattie and the boxes of documents. He reported that word had spread through town. People were talking about the meeting, speculating about what Jonas planned to present. "The Dawsons know something's happening," Tom said. "They've had men watching the church since yesterday. Wade rode through town this morning with 6 of his hands, making sure everyone saw them." "Intimidation," Jonas said. "Last-ditch effort to keep people away. Will it work? We'll find out." By 10:30, Jonas and his small group began walking to the church. They moved slowly to accommodate Miss Hattie's pace, and Jonas carried the boxes of evidence. As they walked down Main Street, people watched from windows and doorways. Some looked curious, others fearful. A few nodded in quiet support. The church doors were open when they arrived. Reverend Matthews stood at the entrance, greeting people as they came. Jonas could see the sanctuary was already half full, and more people were arriving every minute. "Bigger turnout than I expected," Matthews said quietly to Jonas. "Fear or curiosity?" Jonas asked. "Both, I think. And maybe a little hope." Inside, the Dawson brothers sat in the front row on the right side, an obvious statement of position. Wade's face was set in hard lines, his eyes tracking Jonas's every movement. Cole sat beside him, quieter, his expression harder to read. 6 ranch hands stood along the back wall, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. But Jonas noticed their discomfort. These were working men, not gunfighters. They might follow orders, but they weren't eager for violence. Jonas sat up at the front of the church, arranging his documents on a table that Reverend Matthews had provided. Clara and Miss Hattie took seats in the second row. Tom Garrett, Mrs. Chen, Daniel Webb and the others spread throughout the congregation, ready to speak up when needed. The church continued to fill. By 11 o'clock, every pew was packed, and people stood along the walls. Jonas estimated nearly 200 people, almost the entire adult population of Red Bluff. Whatever happened here would be witnessed by the whole community. Sheriff Polk arrived late and stood near the door, his badge catching the light. His face was troubled, torn between duty and self-preservation. Finally, Reverend Matthews walked to the front and called for quiet. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying through the crowded space. "We're gathered here today because there are matters of justice and law that need to be addressed. Jonas Burke has asked to present evidence concerning the water rights that affect all of us. I've agreed to facilitate this meeting as a neutral party. I ask that everyone listen respectfully and save questions until Mr. Burke has finished." He stepped aside, and Jonas moved to stand before the congregation. He could feel every eye on him, feel the weight of expectation and fear and hope. He took a breath and began. "My name is Jonas Burke. Most of you don't know me, but some remember that I visited your town 5 years ago to speak to the school children about wilderness survival. I came back a week ago because Clara Mayfield asked for help after her grandmother was assaulted in the street." He paused, letting that sink in. People shifted uncomfortably. Beside Wade Dawson, Colt Brenner's face reddened. "But what I've discovered since I arrived isn't just about one act of violence. It's about a system of control that's been in place for 15 years. A system built on lies and maintained through fear. Today, I'm going to show you the truth about your town's water rights and give you a choice about what you want to do with that information." Jonas picked up the leather folder containing the town charter. This is the original Red Bluff Town Charter, signed in 1867 by 12 founding citizens. I found it in the church archives. It establishes this town's governing principles and resource management. And it clearly states that the creek and its tributaries are held in common trust for all residents. No individual can claim ownership. Everyone has equal rights. He held up the document so people could see it, though few could read it from that distance. "For 15 years, you've been paying water fees to the Dawson family. Fees that increase whenever they choose. Fees that have cost some of you hundreds or thousands of dollars. But according to the founding document of this town, those fees are illegal. The water belongs to all of you equally." A murmur ran through the congregation. Jonas saw shock on some faces, anger on others. He also saw fear, people glancing toward the Dawsons and their men. Wade Dawson stood up. "This is nonsense. My family has owned the water rights since my father's time. We have legal documentation that contradicts the town charter." Jonas interrupted calmly. "Documentation that was filed after a convenient fire destroyed other records. Documentation that gave your father control of something that legally couldn't be owned. You're calling my father a liar?" Wade's voice was rising, his face darkening. "I'm saying the facts speak for themselves," Jonas replied. "And there are more facts to consider." He picked up one of Miss Hattie's journals. Miss Hattie Mayfield has kept detailed records of life in Red Bluff for 3 years. Her journals document a pattern of intimidation, violence, and property destruction aimed at anyone who questions the Dawson family's control. He opened to a marked page and read aloud about the rancher whose barn burned after he complained about water fees. Then another entry about the merchant who was driven out of business. Then the suspicious death of Daniel Webb's father. With each entry, the murmurs grew louder. People who'd stayed silent about their own experiences suddenly heard their stories validated, heard that others had suffered too. "These aren't isolated incidents," Jonas said. "They're a pattern. A system designed to keep you afraid and compliant." Wade Dawson was red-faced now, his hands clenched into fists. "You come into our town spreading lies and turning people against us." "I'm not turning anyone against you," Jonas said. "I'm just showing them what's already true. What you've worked very hard to keep hidden." Cole Dawson put a hand on his brother's arm, trying to calm him, but Wade shook him off. "This is your last chance, Mountain Man," Wade snarled. "Take your lies and get out of Red Bluff before you regret it." "I'm not leaving," Jonas said. "Not until everyone here knows the truth." He paused, then made a decision. He'd planned to wait, to present the community's case first, before revealing his personal connection. But looking at Wade Dawson's rage and the fear still evident on so many faces, Jonas realized they needed something more, something that made this bigger than just complaints about fees. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. "There's one more thing you should know," Jonas said, his voice dropping lower, "about how the Dawson family came to control this town in the first place." He held up the photograph so people could see the two young men with their arms around each other. "This is my father, Thomas Burke and Samuel Dawson. They founded Red Bluff together in 1858, equal partners. They established the water trust together, built the first structures together, staked their claims together. They were best friends. The church had gone completely silent now. Even Wade seemed frozen, staring at the image. My father went to fight in the Civil War in 1861. He died at Shiloh in 1862. He left behind a wife and a young son, me, according to the partnership. Agreement that my father and Samuel Dawson signed. His share should have gone to his heirs. Instead, Samuel Dawson told everyone my father had no family. He claimed everything for himself. He stole from his best friend's widow and child." Jonas looked directly at Wade Dawson. "Your father built this empire on a lie and a betrayal. Everything you think you own, half of it rightfully belongs to my family. But I'm not here to claim property or money. I'm here because a town that was founded on principles of fairness and partnership has been twisted into something my father would be ashamed of." He set down the photograph and picked up the partnership agreement. "This is proof. Legal, binding proof that the Dawson claim to ownership has no foundation. Your father wasn't a legitimate landowner. He was a thief who betrayed his best friend." Wade Dawson's face had gone from red to white. He stood there, swaying slightly, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Cole Dawson spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent church. "Is this true?" He wasn't asking Jonas, he was asking his brother. Wade turned to look at Cole, and for a moment something passed between them. Then Wade's face hardened again. "It doesn't matter if it's true. We have possession. We have power. That's what matters in this territory." "No," Jonas said firmly, "that's not what matters. What matters is whether this town chooses to live by the principles it was founded on, or whether you all continue to accept tyranny because it's easier than standing up." He looked out at the congregation, at all those faces watching him. "You have a choice today. You can accept what I've shown you and demand change. You can reclaim your water rights, establish proper governance, and build the town your founders intended. Or you can go back to being afraid, paying fees to men who have no legal right to collect them, and teaching your children that might makes right." The silence stretched out, heavy and profound. Then Miss Hattie stood up. Wade Dawson's hand finally moved to his gun, pulling it from its holster in one smooth motion. The sound of it clearing leather echoed through the church like a thunderclap. "Nobody's enforcing anything," Wade said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is my town. My family built it, and no washed-up sheriff and mountain drifter are going to take it from me." The 6 ranch hands along the back wall shifted, hands moving toward their own weapons. The congregation gasped, and several women pulled their children close. Jonas stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't wearing a gun, had deliberately left it behind that morning. Whatever happened now couldn't be resolved with violence. "Put the gun down, Wade," Cole Dawson said quietly. "You're in a church. Stay out of this, Cole. I can't stay out of this. Not anymore." Cole stood up slowly, positioning himself between his brother and Jonas. "If what Burke says is true, Father lied to us our entire lives. He built everything we have on theft. So what?" Wade shouted. "We have it now. Possession is what matters." "No," Cole said firmly. "Honor matters. Truth matters. Father forgot that, and look what it's created. A town that hates us. A legacy built on fear." "You're weak," Wade spat. "Just like I always said?" "Maybe," Cole agreed. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being strong in all the wrong ways." He turned to Sheriff Polk. "What do you need from me?" Polk looked surprised but recovered quickly. "I need a statement admitting your father obtained the water rights fraudulently. And I need you to help establish proper governance going forward." "You're betraying your own family," Wade said, his voice breaking with rage and disbelief. Cole looked at his brother with something like sadness. "No, I'm trying to save what's left of the Dawson name." You can either help me do that with dignity, or I'll do it alone. Wade's gun wavered, still pointed in Jonas's direction, but his conviction clearly shaken. His men at the back of the church looked uncertain, glancing at each other, waiting for direction. Then Tom Garrett stood and moved to stand beside Jonas. Put the gun away. Wade, whatever happens now, happens peacefully. Daniel Webb joined them. Then Mrs. Chen. Then the elderly man who'd known Jonas Burke. One by one, people moved forward, forming a wall of bodies between Wade Dawson and Jonas Burke. They were unarmed, ordinary people, but their collective courage was more powerful than any weapon. Wade looked at the faces in front of him, people he'd known his whole life, people who worked his ranch, bought from his business associates, lived in his town, and he saw that he'd already lost. His hand shook, the gun still raised but pointing at nothing now. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Yes, it is," Jonas said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." Slowly, Cole reached out and took the gun from his brother's hand. Wade didn't resist, just let it go, his face collapsing into something that looked like exhaustion or defeat or both. Sheriff Polk moved forward. "Wade Dawson, I'm placing you under arrest for assault, fraud, and intimidation. Cole Dawson, I'll need that statement from you in writing." "You'll have it," Cole said. The ranch hands at the back began to edge toward the door, but Jonas called out to them. "You're not in trouble," he said. "You were following orders, but those orders stop today. You can find work in Red Bluff that doesn't require you to intimidate your neighbors." They looked at each other uncertainly. Then one of them nodded. "Appreciate that, Mr. Burke." They filed out quietly, and with them went the last of the Dawsons' power. Wade stood there, shoulders slumped, looking smaller somehow. All the bluster and rage had drained out of him, leaving only a middle-aged man who just lost everything he thought made him somebody. Cole put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Come on, let's face this with what dignity we have left." Reverend Matthews spoke into the heavy silence. "I think we've witnessed something remarkable here today, the peaceful restoration of justice. This church was built as a place of grace and redemption, and today it's lived up to that purpose." He looked around at the congregation. "We have work ahead of us, re-establishing the water trust, organizing fair governance, making restitution where possible. But we'll do it together, as a community, the way Jonas Burke and the other founders intended." People began to talk quietly at first, then louder as the tension broke. Relief and excitement mixed together. Children who'd been told to stay quiet started asking questions. The walls of fear that had held Red Bluff captive for 15 years were crumbling. Clara made her way through the crowd to Jonas. Her eyes were bright with tears. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it," Jonas corrected. "You called for help. Miss Hattie provided evidence. All these people found their courage. I just gave them a reason to use it." Miss Hattie joined them, moving slowly but with her head high. She looked at Jonas with something like pride. "Your father would be proud," she said. "You finished what he started." Jonas felt the weight of his father's pocket watch in his vest. "Time reveals all truth." The inscription had been right. Sheriff Polk was organizing details with Cole Dawson, working out how the transition would happen. Wade sat in the front pew, staring at nothing. His empire collapsed around him. Judge Harrison, who'd been in the back of the church, observing quietly, came forward. "Mr. Burke," he said, "I'll need to review all this evidence formally, but based on what I've seen and heard today, I'm prepared to issue an immediate injunction restoring the water rights to community trust. We'll sort out the property claims in due course." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jonas said. The judge nodded. "Took courage to do what you did. This territory needs more men like you." As the crowd began to disperse, people came up to Jonas one by one. Some shook his hand, some thanked him, some just wanted to touch him, as if to confirm he was real. An elderly woman took his hand in both of hers. "I knew your father," she said. "He'd be so proud of you, son." Jonas felt emotion tighten his throat. He'd never known his father, had grown up without that connection. But today, standing in the church Jonas Burke had helped found, completing the work Thomas had started, Jonas felt closer to him than ever before. He was his father's son, not just by blood, but by choice, by the decision to stand for what was right even when it was hard, and that legacy was worth more than any property or inheritance could ever be. 3 weeks had passed since the town meeting that changed Red Bluff forever. The transformation wasn't instant or perfect, but it was real. The Community Water Trust had been formally re-established with a board of 5 elected citizens. Tom Garrett was one of them, as was Mrs. Chen. The board held their first meeting in the church basement and worked out a fair system for water, distribution and maintenance, one that required modest contributions from everyone but no longer enriched a single family. Sheriff Polk, who'd found his spine again, oversaw the transition with surprising efficiency. Wade Dawson had been charged, tried, and found guilty of assault and fraud. He'd been sentenced to 6 months in the territorial prison and a substantial fine. More importantly, his reputation was destroyed. When he was released, he left Red Bluff and was never seen in the territory again. Cole Dawson had stayed, working with Judge Harrison to untangle the complicated property claims. True to his word, he'd admitted his father's fraud and cooperated fully. The Dawson Ranch was being sold to pay restitution, and Cole was using his share to start over somewhere else, some place where the Dawson name didn't carry the weight of shame. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Jonas had told him on the day he left town. Cole had smiled sadly. "I hope I can live with what I found about my family. That's enough for now." Jonas had settled his own inheritance claim quietly, without fanfare. Judge Harrison had confirmed that half of everything Samuel Dawson had claimed rightfully belonged to Thomas Burke's heirs. It was a substantial sum, land and money, that could have made Jonas wealthy by frontier standards. But Jonas didn't want wealth. He'd arranged for most of it to go into a trust for the town, specifically for the school and for families who'd suffered under the Dawsons' rule. Some of the land he kept, thinking he might use it someday, or maybe not. He didn't need to decide right now. What he'd discovered was more valuable than property. He'd found his father's story, learned who Thomas Burke had been, and in doing so, learned something about himself. This morning, Red Bluff was celebrating. The town had commissioned a new bell for the schoolhouse, paid for with money from the restitution fund. It was larger than the old one, with a deeper, richer tone, and it bore an inscription that would be read by generations of students. "Justice rings true, Red Bluff, 1885. The whole town had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Children ran around the schoolyard, excited by the unusual midweek gathering. Merchants had closed their shops. Even the saloon was empty, its owner and patrons standing with everyone else in the autumn sunshine. Reverend Matthews blessed the bell, and Clara pulled the rope for the first time, sending its clear note across the valley. The sound was beautiful, pure and strong, carrying all the way to the mountains where it echoed back like an answer. Jonas stood with Miss Hattie, watching Clara's face as she rang the bell. The young teacher was radiant, her whole being lit up with joy and pride. This was her victory too, Jonas thought. She'd had the courage to reach out when everyone else had given up. After the ceremony, there was food and music. Tom Garrett played the fiddle while his children danced. Mrs. Chen had organized the women into cooking enough to feed everyone twice over. Daniel Webb, who'd found new confidence in recent weeks, was courting one of the farmer's daughters and seemed happier than Jonas had ever seen him. It was the kind of community gathering that happened in healthy towns, the kind Thomas Burke must have envisioned when he first came to this valley. As the afternoon wore on, Jonas found himself walking to the edge of town, to the small cemetery on the hill. Clara saw him go and followed at a distance, respecting his need for solitude but wanting to be nearby. Jonas stood at an unmarked spot where Reverend Matthews had told him his father was supposed to be buried. There was no stone, no marker. Samuel Dawson had seen to that, erasing even the memory of his former partner, but Jonas knew the truth now. His father had been here, had built something good, had tried to establish justice. That legacy lived on, not in property or monuments, but in the principles he'd fought for. Jonas pulled out the pocket watch and looked at the inscription one more time. Time reveals all truth. It had taken 40 years, but the truth had come out. Justice had been restored. He set the watch down carefully on the ground where his father rested. "I finished it, Pa," he said quietly. "What you started. The town's going to be all right." The wind blew across the hilltop, carrying the faint sound of the celebration below. Jonas stood there for a while longer, saying goodbye to a father he'd never known but understood better now. When he turned to leave, he found Clara waiting by the cemetery gate. "Are you heading back to the mountains?" she asked. Jonas had been asking himself that question for days. The mountains called to him, the solitude and simplicity of that life. But something held him here too, something he was still trying to understand. "Not right away," he said. "There's work still to be done, making sure the water board functions properly, helping people adjust. Your grandmother mentioned the school could use someone to teach wilderness skills again." Clara smiled. "She did mention that, several times actually." They walked back toward town together, and Jonas realized that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about leaving. Red Bluff felt different now. It felt like possibility instead of compromise. "Jonas," Clara said as they reached Main Street, "I want to thank you for everything. For coming when I called, for seeing this through, for giving us back our town. You don't need to thank me. You saved yourself, all of you. I just reminded you that you could." "That's not nothing." "No," Jonas agreed. "It's not." The bell rang again, calling people back to the schoolyard for more celebration. Clara took Jonas's arm naturally, as if they'd been walking together like this for years instead of weeks. Below them, Red Bluff spread out in the valley, the mountains rising behind it. The sun was starting to descend, painting everything in gold light. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in the streets without fear. People gathered together, no longer looking over their shoulders. It was a town remembering how to be free. Jonas thought about his father and Samuel Dawson, standing together in that old photograph, arms around each other, full of hope for what they could build. The partnership had been betrayed, but the dream hadn't died. It had just waited, dormant, for someone to remember it and fight for it again. Maybe some things were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth staying for. The bell rang one more time, its voice carrying across the valley, clear and true. A promise that justice wasn't just an ideal, but something real, something that could be restored when good people found the courage to stand together. And in that sound, Jonas heard his father's legacy, his own future, and the heartbeat of a town that had finally come home to itself. He smiled and let Clara lead him back to the celebration, ready at last to be part of something bigger than solitude, something his father would have recognized and approved of, a community built on truth, held together by courage. Red Bluff, reborn,